Hi, everyone. My name is Asmat bin Gapsia. I am on the Sustainable and Impact Investing team at Glenmead Trust, and I am joined by Evelise Vargas and Patricia Ferrar-Rivas. Evelise, I'll pass it on to you. Would love for you to tell us a bit about yourself, your role, and then would love to hear from Patricia.
Great, thank you, Esma. Really excited to be here with you both today. I think this is going to be a great discussion, and thank you to everyone who's joined. My name is Evelise Vargas. I'm a senior investment analyst for the New York City Board of Education Retirement System, also known as BRRS or NYC BRRS. In my capacity as a senior investment analyst, I have broad oversight over our private markets program. We are a $7 billion pension fund. So, our private markets program is about $2 billion or so. And I've been at BRRS for about a year and a half now. So great to be here.
Thank you. Hello, thank you, Esma. I'm Patricia Ferrar-Rivas of Veris Wealth Partners, and I'm a founding partner and the CEO. I also want to thank you, RFK. Thank you for having this panel. It's a great panel. I'm excited to have this discussion and continue this discussion with Esma and Evelise. And thank you for inviting Veris to participate. So we are an impact wealth management firm. We've been around for 13 years. We're 100% focused on impact investing. And I personally have been in the industry since 1992, from when we were talking about socially responsible investing. So I've lived the evolution from socially responsible investing to sustainable investing to impact investing. And social justice has always been a key focus for me, and also a key focus for Veris. So along with other sustainability issues, we were very early on in initiating gender lens investing, and really continue to look at that and what has happened there, and evolving that to focus also on women of color and how to use the path of building that field to build a greater field for investing according to racial justice. So thank you, Esma.
No, thank you both. And we're gathering today to talk about racial equity investing, which feels ever more relevant given current events, the murder of George Floyd, and the murder of several other Black and brown individuals who've come to where the headlines have really focused on their stories, but also recognizing that there are so many more names who have never become trending hashtags, but whose lives are still taken unjustly. And so thinking about the current events this year, but also the history of this country that's rooted in Jim Crow laws and segregation and slavery and the mass genocide of Indigenous people, the question is, what is the role for us as investors, as institutional investors, pension fund managers, asset owners and asset managers, and so on? Often the conversation on racial equity investing and systemic racism, or not racial equity investing, but racial equity more broadly and systemic racism, is one that is delegated to kind of the grassroots activists and the politicians and the elected officials. But as investors, we don't see that this is a conversation relevant for us within our investment processes and within our asset allocation. But when we look at the history of asset management in the US and globally, the implications of where we allocate our capital trickle down to every aspect of society across every sector. Where we choose to allocate means we are deciding what companies, what CEOs, what labor practices are receiving the funding to continue their behaviors for better or for worse. And so when we think about racial inequities in the US, as mentioned, I mean, we are products of our history. And so when we look at the historic policies and systems in the US, they have led us to where we are today. And so I want to just draw out a few statistics that we've compiled within Glenmead in a research report we recently published to look at what is the state of racial inequities in the US. And before I get into these stats to paint this picture, one thing I want to share is a really interesting study that Pew Research developed, where they analyzed sentiments of white Americans around systemic racism and found that about 80% of white Americans think that the racial wealth gap is almost closed in the United States. And so 80%. And that really talks to the disparities where certain racial groups might be really suffering from systemic racism and living, with near zero wealth in assets, and other racial groups, if they're not experiencing that racism, are not even aware of this completely parallel universe that's existing perhaps the next town over. And so when it comes to the wealth gap in the United States, for example, the median net worth of a white household in the United States is $171,000. The median net worth of a Black household in the United States is $17,600, about a tenth of a white household. And the median net worth of a Latino household is about $21,000. When it comes to home ownership, for example, 72% of white families in the United States own their homes, as compared to about 42% of Black families and 47% of Latino families. In terms of the employment gap in the United States, since the United States government started tracking this data in 1972, the Black unemployment gap is double the white unemployment gap at any point in history, consistently. And so when we look at these are outcomes, but these outcomes of disparities within employment, within education, wealth, health, home ownership, and so on, they're results of discriminatory practices that continue today. So for example, studies show that when a candidate who has a stereotypically non-white name, such as Esma Bengabsia or Evelise Vargas, or even Patricia Ferrar-Rivas, when we apply to roles, we are often rejected at double the rates of white candidates holding constant for credentials on resumes. When it comes to capital, studies show that banks deny people of color loans for their businesses at 3 times the rate that they deny white applicants. Again, holding constant for creditworthiness and financial track records. And when they do give these businesses of color loans, they give them at lower principal amounts and higher interest rates. When it comes to education, research shows that there's a $23 billion funding gap between majority white school districts and majority white and non-white school districts in the US. And finally, within housing, studies show, our research was done on 61 major cities in the United States and found that in every single major city, banks and financial institutions denied applicants of color access to home mortgage loans at significantly higher rates than white applicants. And so, for example, in Philadelphia, where my firm is based, banks denied African-American applicants at 2.7 times the rate of white applicants. So what is our role as investors in all of this? Glenmute recently published a report where we pretty much thought about how can we advance racial equity along every step of the investment process. So one, when it comes to assets that are managed in the United States, less than 1% of assets in the US are managed by people of color. So how can we seek to allocate with more diverse managers? How can we also seek to invest in racially diverse and equitable companies? And lastly, within those companies themselves, how can we identify companies that are tackling systemic racism and advancing racial equity, advancing low-income communities of color's access to housing, capital and loans, education, and so on and so forth. And so within that first application of increasing investments with diverse managers, Evelise, I know your team oversees about $7 billion in assets under management. And over the past year, you doubled your allocation with racially diverse managers. So why did your team start this journey, and how did you make this happen?
For sure, and thank you for asking this, and thank you for that context as well. So I think for us, we're governed by a board, and we have 16 board members, or 18 now, but we have board members who deeply care about diversity. New York City is obviously one of the most diverse cities in the world, and we represent all non-pedagogical employees for the Department of Education. So this is something that our board's always been keen on. When you think about, custodial staff at schools, when you think about folks that work in the cafeterias at schools, these are all very diverse people. So our beneficiaries are diverse, and we like, to address that. And I think for our board, it's been board driven, and also, you know, as internal staff, we care about this deeply as well. I think as to how we've done this, we've been invested in fund of funds for some time now on both the public and private side. And I think for us, one of the benefits of this has been being able to achieve diversification while mitigating that potential downside risk of being allocated to any one manager. Especially particularly newer managers. And so a big chunk of that 2% to 4% jump, the way we doubled in the past year, was due to graduations in our fund of funds, in our existing fund of funds. And that's something that we consider low-hanging fruit, if you will, because we already have a look through to performance. We have track records, and that has been something that we continue to monitor. The other thing that I'll say on this front is I think, everyone at this conference, everyone that's either on the LP or GP side, we're all very intelligent, motivated, aware people, especially to be at this conference. And I think if you want to do it, you will. I truly believe that. And we had, again, board support, executive team support, and we all bought into this. And it was something that we cared about from jump. So, I think there's, as LPs, we benefit from doubling down, no pun intended, on diverse asset managers. So, I think if we want to do it, we can, and I, highly encourage anyone to ask me questions, and happy to engage on this further.
That's an excellent point. Thank you, Evelise. And Patricia, so you oversee about $1.5 billion in assets under management at Veris Wealth Partners. Evelise is managing investments in traditional funds and working to ensure that they're managed by diverse managers. So double their allocation over the past year and continually working to increase that. But on the other end, you're working on impact investments specifically. So you're not only looking to increase the diversity of the managers of the strategies on your platform, but also looking to achieve some form of impact outcome, whether that's positive, environmental, or social impact. And a lot of your investments focus on community wealth building in low-income communities of color across the country. How have you done this? Can you give us a few examples of the investments that you've made and what's the impact that they have had?
Yeah, so I would say that initially, a lot of our community development work or community investment did go through CDFI, so Community Development Financial Institutions. And now we're really looking at what are the opportunities in market rate investments. While we continue to do that work with cash and CDFIs, and I think it's important work to do, we're really finding investment managers, especially on the private side, that are investing, that are both managers that they themselves are made up of the leadership of the team of people of color, but also the underlying investments that they're investing in are investing in ways to build the wealth in communities. And when we talk about wealth, we're talking about equity, but we're also talking about all the other aspects of wealth that include opportunity, wellness, access to food, access to finance, all of those aspects as well. So there's a couple of investments that I'd really like to mention in particular. And of course, this is our personal due diligence. And of course, everybody has to do their own due diligence in looking at these. It's my disclaimer there. But there's three. One is HCAP, which is a debt instrument. I'm going to talk about Illumin Capital, which is a fund of fund. And then I'm also going to talk about Impact America, which is a single fund, and do that very quickly. So just give you the highlights. But HCAP Capital is a debt fund, and what they do is they're investing in companies that are creating quality jobs. And they've worked with a number of different institutions and foundations to really define what is a really high quality job. And so in doing so, the companies that they are investing in are bringing employees in that are from low income communities. So the majority of those individuals are African American or Latinx. And many also a high percentage of women as well. And so part of what they do is really build a positive job environment, which includes benefits and often, which I'll mention, also looking at those companies that are offering opportunities to have ownership in the company and opportunities, key opportunities for advancement within the company to go into positions of leadership and management of the company. Second is looking at Lumen Capital. And Lumen Capital is a really brilliant concept around a fund-to-fund approach and really addressing issues of biases. As we know, the statistics around the percentage of venture capital that goes to people of color, to women and people of color, are in the low single digits. That's where capital is going. I always say capital is like water. You know, it can either be destructive or nurturing. I had another great thing is like money's like manure. If you spread it around, it does well. If you stick it in one place, it starts to stink. So I thought that this is a good, you know, it's like what we are doing is by not investing and spreading those venture capital dollars around to people, diverse populations, we are actually not growing a very healthy society. We're not growing communities that also have strong middle class investments. We're not building communities where people have home ownership, that own their own businesses. And so Lumen works with fund managers to help them and train them to eliminate the biases when they are looking at companies. What are those biases that need to be reduced? And one of the interesting things their study showed, which is really quite devastating to think of, was when they did studies, and I won't go into all the details, but the end result of the study was that actually investments, when people were doing due diligence, firms of people of color that actually were more successful were less likely to get money. So it's the more you succeed, which has been a story for especially African Americans in this country for years. The more you succeed, the more you're a target, the more you're oppressed, the more you have blockades to opportunities. The last one is Impact America, that is a firm run by Keisha Cash, an African-American woman, and she really invests and looks at kind of what are the shadow economies in communities that really are those economies that really support the community. And so her investments have really focused on low-income communities. Also, that being so, that ends up being most of her investments tend to be with the owners or leaders of those companies are people of color and women. So those are a number of examples. They're out there. I think that's what's so exciting is it's the opportunities are there. People have not been looking for them in the right way.
Absolutely. But to that point, at least when you're looking at investments, your sole mandate as a pension fund manager is to identify and make investments that seek to generate strong risk-adjusted returns. So impact intentionality, though may be valuable in your personal portfolio, is not part of your mandate as a pension fund manager. On the flip side, Patricia, a lot of your impact investments are still seeking to generate competitive market rate returns. And so given both of your goals, as fiduciaries for, either those whose pensions you're managing or Patricia, for your clients, some might say that considerations of race and racial factors and systemic racism should not be relevant to the investment process and is not relevant to the investment process. And so what would you say to that? As you think about the racial diversity of your managers, Evelise, and a lot of the racial factors and implications around racial equity for you, Patricia, what would you say, what value add are you seeing from the risk management side or the financial returns side? Would love to hear from Evelise and then Patricia around this.
For sure. And much has been said about the business case for diversity. You can go to Harvard Business School or McKinsey if you want to read about that, but much has been discussed on that front. I think for us, and I think for me as an individual, encompassing the identities that I do encompass, being a woman, being, first generation American, Dominican, I also identify as Black and queer, those identities inform the way I interact with the world, period. And that also extends to how I interact with managers we might be looking to invest with. I think it's interesting you asked that question because it reminds me of some of the more kind of striking conversations I've been able to have since joining Burrs. And one of them was with a woman of color-led public equity shop. They're called Ultraview Capital. They manage some money for us. They're out in Seattle. And I remember one of the PMs talking about their holdings. And I'm not going to mention which holding it was in particular, but just how the way she grew up impacted this particular purchase, which was a purchase of, a conglomerate of dollar stores, and how growing up the way she grew up in the environment she grew up informed how she invested. And for me, growing up in the South Bronx, which is where I grew up, that conversation really struck a chord with me, because there are market opportunities that other folks might not be attuned to, but because of the way you grow up, because of the identities you inhabit, they inform the investment decisions you make. And I was lucky to have a discussion with one of the folks from Harlem Capital, again, since I've joined Burrs. And I had the same discussion where I was like, wow, you all invested in Blavity. Blavity has had such a substantial impact on me as a millennial of color, like as a Black, queer Dominican woman, millennial. And so it's just, I think and you see that in the returns as well. So I think even though we our goal first and foremost is that fiduciary, that duty, I think we all know that there's value add, and we all know that there's a plethora of case studies that demonstrate this. So it can be both and it is. I think that's what we're realizing more and more.
Yeah, I would just follow up on that. It really is both and I think that especially if we look at who the populations in the United States is, for example, if you want people that are leading companies that are representative of the demographics of the country, and those are our consumers. So just from a very, kind of top level macroeconomic, who's making those decisions about who's going to buy what, and bringing in, making sure that the companies that are innovative and nimble are people that are also just part of day-to-day life, and that it represents the demographics of our country. I think that one of the things that we've really seen that's been really interesting, both on the public side and on the private side, since this whole issue with COVID, we'll certainly see, what happens after this next market disruption. But we've really seen those companies that the funds we've been investing in and the underlying companies that they're investing in are doing better through this period. And often they're doing better because they're diverse people that are really looking at diverse workforces, looking at who's in leadership, looking at the wage discrepancies. Those companies are often very strong management teams as well, too. Indications of taking these factors into account and how you're running your company are indications that lead you to strong managers, and strong managers do better. So we're really seeing our portfolios fared much better during this period. And on the private equity side, where we were really concerned about, what could be happening in this disruption, often they were in industries that really did dealt with health, dealt with working from home, dealt with all of these aspects that actually could do well in this period. And that they were also, we saw a number of companies able to be nimble enough to adjust, because, it is a diverse workforce and diverse leadership that is bringing in, new ideas, willing to be innovative, not stuck in old ways of thinking of how things need to move forward, and really being able to be in that moment and say, well, how do we become a different type of company in this period and still maintain our mission?
These are excellent points. And the U.S. Census Bureau projects that by 2032, the majority of the working age population in the United States will be people of color and non-white. And by 2042, the population overall in the U.S. will be non-white. And so on one end, thinking about the positive impact of this is crucial. But on the other end, in terms of just making smart investment decisions, if you're not investing in racially inclusive business models, more often than not, those business models are going to be moot within the next 10 years, because the majority of the consumers in the US who have buying power will be non-white. And so, Evelise, you bring the example of Blavity, and then there are several others across sectors. Often I just bring up the example of Fenty Beauty, which is a case study that I researched within our racial equity investing report. And when Fenty Beauty was released, Rihanna, the founder, very much built the brand around racial inclusion, racial representation, which is, it sounds, incredible and is extremely emotionally appealing, but is also an incredibly intelligent business strategy. Studies show that her products had sold out within the first week of the launch of the beauty line. And when you look at reports from the makeup stores where her products were being sold, those products that sold out were actually, the ones that sold out first were the ones that catered to darker skinned women, because darker skinned women in the US are an often neglected consumer segment by the beauty industry. And so Rihanna identified this market gap, catered to it, and realized significantly profitable returns. An analyst who studied her sector and this company from Carlyle Group said that she potentially changed the beauty care industry in the United States permanently. Yeah. And so again, when we talk about fiduciary duty and pension fund managers and seeking to generate, strong financial returns, racial inclusion is a component that cannot be neglected. And by being neglected in itself poses a risk factor in the investment process. The one other thing that I think is interesting to think about is the nature of fiduciary duty. So my mother is a public school teacher in North New Jersey, and her pension fund may be invested in guns and in certain problematic sectors. Now, how does that impact her as a teacher when we see the prevalence of school shootings in America? On one end, maybe her pension fund might make strong financial returns off of gun investments, but also what's the value of that if that puts her and everyone in that school at risk of being shot by someone who might have bought a gun from that same company that her pension fund is invested in. So overall, interesting things to think about. I know we're almost up on time, but want to pass it on to you both. If there are any closing remarks, anything you really want to leave the audience with before we wrap up.
I mean, I think just, something that I said already, I think it's incumbent upon us to take a really close look at how we can continue advancing the mission of diversifying asset management, whether it be by investing in diverse owned firms or pushing majority owned firms to do better, quite frankly, on the I&D front. I'm excited to collaborate with fellow LPs and talk to GPs about this, but really thank you, and let's keep doing this.
Yeah, I would say that certainly the current issues that we've been faced with and what we've had to deal with, both with COVID, re-exposing the inequities in society, in wealth, in health, that it is an opportunity that I'm seeing more and more financial firms, both individual fund managers and larger firms, really realize that this is the time to really take this on and really change the numbers. The numbers have to be changed, and we can only help because we know it's been tried before. We know there's been quotas before. We know that there's, like emerging managers, right, that people have used. But the thing is that and we know that there's blockades and issues around that, but this is the reality. It is really about the health in the long term of us as a community, as a nation, as a global community, and that it's not easy work, but it's just think how rewarding it's going to be for us to really, dismantle systemic racism. I mean, there's when you, I don't know, blow up an old building. It's kind of the thrill people get from that when we can finally kind of dismantle this infrastructure and have a new, fresh infrastructure. So that would be it's not easy, but it is certainly fulfilling.
Doable.
Yes, and very doable.
Yeah. With enough investors on board and different key players, I hope. Great. Well, thank you everyone for your time. Sorry we didn't have time for questions, but feel free to connect with us on LinkedIn. We're happy to always continue the conversation and be as resourceful to you all as we can be.